Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands and to our first tier list video. This is Christopher Nolan. So as most of you are probably aware by now, Christopher Nolan is coming out with Oppenheimer this year. It is his new movie coming out dealing with the creation of the atomic bomb. And
No, it's about the creation of Barbenheimer. Barbenheimer.
I'm excited for that, and we have shirts.
We do have shirts.
We will post a picture of ourselves on Instagram.
We should do a quick Greta Gerwig tier list. Let's see. S tier Little Women, S tier Lady Bird. I think we're good.
Oh yeah, we're good. Yeah, everything she does is fantastic. So
Yeah, she's made 2 films.
Wait, okay, this is not about Barbie. Anyways, getting back to Christopher Nolan, this is a Christopher Nolan tier list. This is our first tier list we've ever done. I hope to do more of these in the future. You know, basically we're going to go through Christopher Nolan's movies in chronological order. Jeffrey and I have not talked about our tier lists, so we're hoping for maybe some surprises and good discussion over where we place these movies.
Yeah, originally this was going to be a Christopher Nolan ranked video, but you had the great idea to do a tier list because it allows us to talk about one film at a time together instead of me saying, my number 1 is this, and you say, well, I talked about that 5 movies ago. I prefer a ranking, but I think a tier list is perfect in terms of conversation, so I look forward to doing that.
Okay, should we get started with following then?
In many ways, it's a product of the circumstances that are around it. Number 1, it's his first film. You're looking at it as a piece of the whole, a piece of Christopher Nolan's filmography in a starting point for what he would later become, you know, quite a bit better at. This film was made for $6,000. It's a nothing amount of money, and when you look at a lot of the things he did for this film, when you read about it, he used natural light simply because he didn't have the money. He hired his friends, things like that. I think this film is decent enough. I think you could kind of look at it in 2 ways and say, wow, he did so much with so little. If Following came out tomorrow, I think we would look at it and we would say, wow, this shows a lot of promise as a filmmaker. Looking at it in the breadth of his filmography, it can't help but feel like a little bit of a eat your vegetables moment. You know, just to watch all of Nolan's films, you have to see this one, see where he started, see where a lot of his tricks, especially with chronology and some of the criminal underworld and feuding between people and double crosses and etc., where that originated from. And that's how I view it. But I am going to say that it's a C tier film for him.
Same. I put it in the C tier as well. And for pretty much the same reasons. As you said, there are a lot of things that point to where he's going to take this direction in the future, pairing up with like really good cinematographers, and also the budget. I think budget just increases so many more opportunities. And obviously not to say that a film can't be good without, you know, a decent budget. We've seen a lot of instances of that. But I think in terms of what Christopher Nolan does, more money really helps him in a certain way, because I think it takes a lot of his narratives and a lot of the big ideas he has and expands them in a way that the money's necessary to the product that he's always trying to create.
Yeah, and I think what we'll see as we go on is there's a true progression here, right? I think the example I always use is Tom Waits had to make Swordfish Trombones before he made Rain Dogs. Maybe a more palatable example is the Beatles had to make Rubber Soul before they could make Revolver, before they could make Sgt. Pepper, before they could make the White Album. It was a clear progression. And I think Christopher Nolan has a clear progression that starts here.
Yeah, and one of those things in terms of Following itself is its narrative. It is building this story that is a bit disjointed and you're not sure where it's going. It's something that he does in a lot of its movies where the end is really a tying of the knot of all these themes throughout the movie. And he really does bridge that in this film in a certain way. I think there were a couple negatives to this movie. I hate to point out that there was a very unfortunate use of the F word in this film that did not sit with me well at all.
I don't know if we should have like a discussion about this now, but I actually excuse films for that for the most part. In a certain way, like if it was contemporary at the time to use that, it doesn't bother me that much.
This film came out in 1998. Like, I don't give it too much of a pass for
I was
that.
probably saying the F word in 1998.
Yeah, it's more about the use of it that bothered me. I saw this more recently than you had because I actually hadn't seen this movie until a couple of weeks ago. When I was
very true.
making sure I was preparing for this video. And to me, the use of it was very unnecessary because it didn't really mean anything. It wasn't used in a historical context. I just thought it was just out of place and it didn't really make much sense to either the character development or not. Something that bothered me and I did want to get off my chest. But other than that, this was a great example of the beginnings of Christopher Nolan. So on to Memento, Christopher Nolan's second film. Memento has a little bit of a special place in my heart because I wouldn't say I was very much into more serious films in terms of adult nature. And I think Memento was one of the first things I saw. My mom and I got it on Redbox and we watched it together. I loved how complex the story was and how it was really just a race through time. The pacing of it is so fast paced and it's continuously moving and it's continuously making you think about what's actually happening. I put this on my tier list as an A. I really enjoyed Memento. I think it's taking everything and following, and it's really improving upon itself. I love the way that this film is broken up in terms of moving entirely backwards through time and revealing itself. Of course, the first scene is pretty much near the end of the movie as well, but the idea of how we got here, which we've seen a lot in film, I think was done very uniquely in this movie. The concept of not remembering things, having to write them down, like so many of those little details were almost little clues that we got to follow along as an audience. And it's one of my favorite things about the movie.
Yeah, I really like Memento. I think I'm doing the thing now that I do in a lot of our reviews where I'm weighing my personal feelings about the film versus its academic and film merit as, like, you know, in film criticism. It's not a movie I rewatch a lot. It's not a movie I really feel like has a ton of value, like a ton of rewatchability value outside of the first time you see it and then the second or third time you see it to pick up all the little details. I look at it and after a couple of rewatches, I think it's kind of an empty experience. He really can't undermine what an explosion this was, not only in the film world, but in my personal life among my film-loving friends when we were in high school. So, I mean, for that reason, I give it B tier. I think it's absolutely an essential stepping stone in his filmography.
So next up, we have Christopher Nolan's 2002 film, Insomnia. One of the first cases in which there's a cast that is really well known. You have Al Pacino, you have Robin Williams, you have Hilary Swank in the 3 title roles in this movie.
And this was during the Robin Williams serious renaissance where he started doing serious films, kind of like around 1 Hour Photo.
What I actually really love so much about Insomnia is I feel like it's the first time Christopher Nolan got character down to such an extent which I was actually thought-provoked by his characters. Al Pacino, his character as well, the main detective in this film, by the end, there's so much to contemplate about him as a character, trying to solve a murder case, but he's also trying to cover up his own murder of his own partner, which granted was accidental, but there's this ideological thing going on is he as bad as the murderer who killed this other woman? I love the tussle between him and Rob Williams in this movie, and also Hilary Swank's role, her becoming a budding detective. What path is she going to take in her role in terms of being truthful and honest and getting to the heart of this mystery? You have the cinematography, you have the narrative, you have the character development. I think all of it, and something ideologically to think about at the end. So I really enjoyed this movie. I put it as a as well as I did.
Oh, an A tier.
Yeah,
wow,
yeah.
That's really high. Okay. I give this a B tier. I think it's really good, actually. And it's almost something I would want more from Nolan because in this film, you're right, he focuses on the fundamentals. He focuses on character, focuses on plot construction. He focuses on thematic heft and thematic material and all of it kind of tying together well and meshing with the characters as the film, you know, continues. I like it in a way because it's him doing straight film noir. You know, there's not a lot of messing around. The movie isn't moving backwards. There's not, you know, him moving chronology around. It's just a straight film noir that's done very exceptionally and very well. In some ways, that's its detriment as well. It's almost like a benefit in his filmography because he does things that are so different moving forward. He never makes a straight film noir again. He doesn't make a lot of movies that take place in reality in one way or another. But I do think this film is successful in that regard. The only thing I have against it, and this is kind of a personal thing, is that it's a remake of a Norwegian film that I've seen that's so much better.
I did not know that.
And the film is, as you imagine, because it's a foreign film, it's quite a bit more complicated. It's quite a bit more thematically confused. It's a lot more ambiguous in terms of where the loyalties lie and what the real true morality of the film is, whereas Nolan comes down on one side and says, this is the correct thing. You know, this is the moral thing to do. So when I compare the two, I just like the Norwegian one a bit more. And I see a touch of Americanized kind of commercialism in this film. Although I do think it's very good. So I think going into Batman Begins, this is his biggest leap as a filmmaker. So Insomnia, all things considered, is a fairly small film. I don't know what its budget was, but it's not a ton of money. And you could tell that by the way it's shot. It uses locales and it uses a lot of things that don't cost a lot of money to make production value. Whereas Batman Begins, again, I don't know the budget, but it's a lot. He basically has to build a city and build a Batmobile and all these things. So anyway, it's a true example of something that Marvel says they do, although I don't think that they do it very well, whereas they take a very promising independent filmmaker and they give them a lot of money to do something interesting with, you know, a property that maybe we all know in culture. This is a tough one to weigh because you have an extraordinary sequel that comes after it. People feel a variety of ways about the third film that we'll get to. And it's really about if you can center yourself and say, how did you feel about this when it began? How did you feel about Batman Begins when you saw it in theaters? And I did feel very positively. I saw it and I said, this is such a step up from the Joel Schumacher films. It's so much more serious. It takes its thematic material so seriously. It's very tightly made. Something as simple as when Alfred says, why do we fall so we can get back up? That's something that appears 3 times in the film. And the last time is the most impactful. I also like how it brought in the hero's journey. So that's something that Joseph Campbell is known for popularizing. The hero's journey is something that Luke Skywalker goes on, that Harry Potter goes on, that Jesus goes on. And it's applied to this film in a really intelligent way and brings Batman back to the forefront of the way that we thought of him. Because really, like, the Schumacher films almost felt like Batman was over.
I think one of the things that Batman Begins really did was reconceptualize what a superhero movie could be. A really extreme step up in the film quality of his movies. And I think Insomnia was a good step up from the previous work. And then this, I think, is just another level. Of course, with production design and developing all those things in the mood, like so much of that comes down to the director's choices. Oh, I don't think you said where you're going to put this on your tier list.
B tier.
Okay, I put it as A tier.
How many A's do you have?
I don't know what to tell you. We'll find out.
Well, we do have a lot of A's. Okay. I guess I have a lot of B's.
Your B movies have been my A movies so far, so maybe I look at them a little bit higher regard. But it was a really good beginning at an intellectual look at a superhero character.
It completely revitalized what it could be.
It wasn't just this inspirational thing about what a superhero could be. It's about the struggle with that, the moral struggles and the complexities. This really changed that concept of a superhero movie. So going on from here, because we were talking about The Dark Knight as being his next Batman movie, but in between these 2 movies, he made a little film called The Prestige, which wasn't as much a little film. I mean, it starred another plethora of amazing actors, including Christian Bale once again. It looks like he did 3 movies in a row with him, and Hugh Jackman. You know what it is about The Prestige? I think it's a little bit bloated. By the end of the movie, I didn't feel the weight of what it was trying to tell me. I got it and I understood it, but the whole movie kind of felt to me, and this might sound a little bit harsh, but it felt like 2 toxic men just fighting the entire movie.
Yeah. C tier. Let's go.
Yes, I put it in C tier.
I put it in C tier too. So I think that when people make fun of Christopher Nolan for being too convoluted, it's like this movie is all of the evidence. And not only that, but I just don't think 2 magicians having this rivalry with one another is as interesting as Batman fighting criminals or the nature of space and time or dreamscapes. Like it doesn't have the material.
In the end, it was just like, oh, I got you in the end. It's just like, okay.
And they continually get one another and trick one another. Whoever tricks the last person last before it cuts to black is how it's going to end.
They're made as the winner when really all these people died. His own wife hung herself of not being loved because of the way he was treating her. And by the end, he's heralded as this saint-like figure in the end because he won and he gets his daughter back and just ignores all these things the bad things that happen.
It's so weird because this movie is like simultaneously overcooked and undercooked. It's like undercooked thematically and character-wise, but it's overcooked with its convoluted story. I don't know. The Dark Knight, S tier. I mean, I don't know really I don't have a hot take. It's a great movie. I mean, it's literally one of the best movies of the century so far. I think it has more in common with Heat or an extremely well-crafted Michael Mann film than it does with any superhero film I've ever seen. Not only is it extraordinarily crafted and just so well made, I mean, there's so much tension in the direction. There's so much intelligence in the way that it's edited. All of the practical effects, he flipped a tractor trailer. I still don't know how they did that. And I was 18 when this movie came out. One of the best villains that I've ever seen in Heath Ledger's Joker. And frankly, some really unsettling implications about human nature. I think that was the thing that I took from this film most potently, is it has this fundamentally deep and cynical view of human nature that we're all just so panicked. We're all so beholden to demagoguery that we'll believe anything that we hear as long as it makes us feel safe. There's a lot of really scary implications in this film that I think are even more resonant today in the various moral panics that are going on in our nation right now. The Dark Knight is it's so good. You can watch it with your parents as a suspenseful crime epic that's super interesting and it's good. You can watch it as a superhero film and it's good. You can write a philosophy paper on it and reference Immanuel Kant and it's still good. It is the rarest occasion in that an extremely mainstream idea and film that had a lot of money behind it is like a supreme work of art, and that just never happens.
Gosh, I don't know what to add to that. that was just very phenomenally said. So
Thank you.
you're very welcome. I'm going to pick apart a few things that you said, but just talk a little bit more in depth about them. But the production design and the practical effects of this film, I think, are just emblematic of the top ideal of what superhero movies could be. This is one of the problems I've been having with a lot of Marvel movies lately. We're tearing down Marvel on this video, and I've loved a lot of Marvel films, so it's not to say that, but I think there's a lot has been lost in terms of the practical scale of things that I miss. And I think The Dark Knight really phenomenally did so many of these stunts and action sequences. You could feel that truck flipping just because it was real. And just the amount that's done on a blue screen nowadays, it feels almost forced and two-dimensional. It's losing a sense of the practicality, which this movie just has in freaking spades throughout the entire thing. That one sequence where he's on the motorcycle and he's driving through underground mall or something like that,
Yeah,
busting through the window, I was absolutely insane. I also put in my S tier, obviously. And just Heath Ledger, Christian Bale, I think they're dynamic as actors, is just so phenomenal in this movie. Heath Ledger in particular, one of the best roles, of course, as the Joker, and in terms of movie history, I think, in terms of a superhero movie, in terms of a villain, it cannot be surpassed. Number one for me. So moving on from The Dark Knight, we had another film, just like The Prestige, stuck in between his Batman movies, and this one was Inception. We have another absolutely mind-bending film with a very unique concept. One of the things I love so much about Christopher Nolan is really building these unique concepts and narratives. You're going to a theater and having an experience that you have never had before. And I think Inception is a new level of that in Christopher Nolan's repertoire. I gave this movie an S tier as well with The Dark Knight. I was on the edge of my seat this entire movie. Just what's going to happen next? Where is this going? I love the build. I love the score in this movie. It's absolutely fantastic.
I find Hans Zimmer a little bombastic sometimes, but I love his score in this film. I think Inception is great. I also give it S tier. It's interesting that, in my opinion, he made his two best films back to back. Pretty extraordinary achievement. Something he does a lot in his films that I really respect is he just throws you into the midst of the action. Inception's been out for 10 plus years at this point. It's hard to put yourself in the shoes of when you first saw the film, but imagine yourself in the theater when you first saw Inception and a bunch of images of beaches and people, and you're like, okay. And then suddenly he's at the table and he's talking about this whole thing of dreamscapes and how to enter people's dreams. And then suddenly we realize that that's a dream. And then we go to a different level where there's like a riot outside and we think that's real. Then we find out that that's a dream, and they're kicking each other into bathtubs. They're doing the thing called the kick. They're using all of this terminology and these colloquialisms that we don't know at all right now as an audience, that's gradually revealed to us later throughout the film. That sense of mystery, that sense of confusion, is one of the reasons I love the film so much. It's also one of the reasons I like Christopher Nolan a lot, is he allows you to be confused, and he gives you great catharsis in paying off the confusion. I don't think he ever does that better than Inception, actually.
What I love so much about that is it was also a great explainer of the theory behind Inception in terms of the movie itself and the narrative, because it showed you the cause for it and the reasoning and how it occurs. And then you get this wonderful sequence between Leonardo DiCaprio and Elliot Page, which really bridge and describe in more detail from a dialogue perspective of what Inception is and what they're trying to do. So I love that you get that opening sequence that throws you in it to give you the visual representation of the whole thing. And then you get the explainer. And then again, you go into the visuals with the explanation of what's happening.
I just need to say, I need to call out my friend Tom Murphy, who I saw this film in theaters, I think 3 or 4 times, and one of the times I saw it was with him. And you remember in the final sequences, there's the first layer of dreams that has the van falling.
Yeah.
And he called this film exposition, cut to van, because it cuts to the van so many times. I don't know if he watches this, but shout out to Tom Murphy for that hilarious comment. Also,
Side note, one of the best endings of a movie in recent cinematic history, I would say.
Yeah, thank God that they don't tell you if it lands or not at the top, because it's frankly, it's so much more interesting that way.
It really is.
Okay, maybe a hot take. The Dark Knight Rises is really good. I actually like it a little bit better, I think, than Batman Begins. A lot of what people say about it is true. It's too convoluted, there's too many villains, Bane is kind of a weak villain, but there's so many things I like about it.
I mean, in the end, he's not even the real villain.
I know. But namely, it does, I think, what trilogies are supposed to do by bringing Bruce back to the beginning of his story. There are some logical fallacies, I think, with the way it approaches its story. But there are just so many breathtaking sequences. The football field, that
The
whole
plane sequence in the beginning.
The opening 15 minutes is crazy. It's just like totally spellbinding. I love Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character. I thought he was a really great addition to the film. I like this idea of Gotham being held hostage. Gotham is kind of like a stand-in for New York. New York is a city that I feel very personal about, that, you know, we visited ever since our childhood. So the idea of a whole city being held hostage, I think, is something that like made its way into my heart pretty easily. It's one of the few times in a Batman film that I've had this feeling of, how are they ever going to come back from this? They took over the whole city. How are they going to solve this, right? And just the catharsis of it being solved so eloquently and with so much justice actually gave me like quite a bit of a good feeling. You and I watched it somewhat recently. I hadn't watched it in a long time, and I remember defending it when it came out, and I still feel like defending it. I think it's actually a pretty good finale.
So what do you put on your tier list?
B.
Oh, B. I put it as a B as well. I thought you were going to put it higher because you said you liked it more than Batman Begins, but it's also on the same level too.
It's on the same level as Batman Begins.
But you're just saying,
yeah,
like
as far as a B, but I do like it better.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What's interesting is I'm about to say things I didn't like about it as much, which is interesting because we both put it at the same part.
I'd be interested to hear what you liked about it too, though.
Okay.
Unless it just mirrors what I said.
A lot of it actually just mirrors what you said. I think some of the sequences absolutely brilliant. That's why I mentioned the plane sequence at the beginning, because I thought that was just insane. Like you said, the plethora of characters, I think takes a little bit away from Christian Bale's character in a certain regard, because I thought there was such moral complexity there, and I felt it was lost a little bit in this third movie. Bane as a character, the whole reveal at the end where he turns out to not actually be, like he's more of just a puppet. I feel like there wasn't enough building of her character.
I agree, that doesn't work. The movie almost feels embarrassed by that reveal because it goes through it so fast.
It does.
Like, yeah, and then we're chasing each other again.
So part of me, and this is gonna sound bad, but it felt very Rise of Skywalker to me, where it's like, oh, it's this guy coming back from the first movie that we didn't expect.
In that instance, yes.
This is a much better movie than The Rise of Skywalker, in my opinion. The Rise of Skywalker, I am referring to, but it does not exist in my headcanon. I don't think it ever happened.
Rise of Skywalker D-, this movie B+.
Rise of Skywalker F. All right, Interstellar.
C tier. Bullshit.
Oh yeah, you don't really like Interstellar as much as some other people.
I gave it B tier.
Oh, you give it B tier?
Yeah. So I gave it.
Why'd you say bullshit at the beginning?
I just wanted to incite you.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I would say that this is my lowest B tier.
Okay.
I don't think it's C tier. I was about to use this as a criticism, but this is a thing he does a lot. He takes really high-minded concepts, he weaves them into his story, and I think a lot of people look at those concepts as if they're the first time they've ever heard of them, and maybe it is. But really what he's doing is he's taking quantum physics, the theory of quantum physics, and applying it to various things in his story. Same thing with Inception, with dream logic and reality and metaphysics, etc. I think Interstellar is really good for most of it. I think the first 2 hours or so is really solid. When they're going to different planets, when they're training, there's a lot of intrigue there. There's a lot of mystery. Nobody knows what they're actually going to encounter on these other planets and these other spaces and these other times. I actually like, it's kind of a bit of a divergence, but I like the Matt Damon bit. I actually think that works well as its own sort of short film. But I think the film really hinges on this idea of, out of all these huge questions we have, love is the thing that's the answer. And that just doesn't work for me.
When does that ever work for you?
No, sometimes it does. We just watched an episode of The Bear, and it ends with it ends with a certain moniker that I found really touching. I think the film is so good at asking questions that it maybe shouldn't have tried to find its own answers or something. I'm not totally sure, but I know that the idea that the whole story hinges on love between people just doesn't work for me, and it felt overly corny. Thinking back on the story, I think the film is not as well structured as some of his other films, actually.
Well, I definitely disagree with you in a lot of these regards because I put it in S tier.
Number one, you're wrong. Number two, it's a very emotional film. And I think that if you're somebody that responds to Hans Zimmer and you respond to high emotions, that this movie works.
I feel like this is a way of saying I'm not intelligent enough to think that this is a good movie on its own.
That's absolutely not saying that.
Yes.
You are more susceptible to emotion than I am.
Exactly. So you're saying the emotions are overwhelming my ability to think critically about this movie.
That doesn't mean that it's negative, but Interstellar is a more emotional movie than Inception is.
I need more wine. Wait, there's no more wine.
You want some tequila?
Yes, I need some tequila. Where's the tequila?
Here, have that reposado. No, the one next to it. Yeah.
Okay. This is what it's come to.
Yes, Interstellar, I think, leans too heavily on its emotions for the sake of story, whereas Inception actually has a good story, so it doesn't need to resort to overwhelmingly emotional swelling of Hans Zimmer stuff.
Yes, I think the emotional beats are really well built in this film. It is Christopher Nolan's most emotional movie at this point, I think. Its relationships and its character development. I mean, it's this wonderful story about a father and his daughter. And I think they build that really well in this film. And pairing along with the musical score in this movie, I think is just absolutely amazing. There are some brilliant sequences in space that take place with the big space station thing that they're in that's taking them to the new worlds. The way that's spinning.
I mean, the giant wave, I know that that's visual effects, but I mean, that's a spellbinding scene.
That is an absolutely spellbinding scene. And you have Anne Hathaway in this movie as well, and she's absolutely amazing in this movie. One of the things I appreciate about this film, and also I guess this could apply to a lot of Christopher Nolan movies, this film demands a lot of its audience. I love that about Christopher Nolan in general. Spends a lot of time not catering to you on the lowest common denominator.
That's very true of him.
I mean, you have complex physics going on in this movie, and he has a way of really showing that in a cinematic sense. You don't feel turned off. You might be a little confused, but I think if you just stay on the wavelength of the movie and not try to understand it too much, but just take it for what it is, I think he does a great job of explaining it enough that you can just follow along for the ride, especially these complex subject matters and narratives that he builds in a lot of his films.
So Dunkirk I gave A tier. I think the only knock about Dunkirk is because he's telling a true story, it maybe drains him of some of the creativity, and some of the lavish ideas that he has in a lot of his films aren't quite as evident here, but he's retelling a story that's true, so I guess that makes sense. But I think there's a case to be made that this is maybe the best directed film of his career from a technical standpoint.
I'm pretty sure I looked this up earlier, but I think Dunkirk is his highest rated movie in terms of Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes.
It's the most classically made, and I think it's the most obviously well made. It's extraordinarily well shot from a technical perspective. It's directed with a lot of tension. His idea of taking chronology and mixing it up a little bit, he uses it in this film, but it's in a way that I think makes a lot of sense and isn't as alienating as a lot of his other films.
It's very much more approachable in this movie.
But there are some shots in this film that if you think about how to orchestrate them from both a technical standpoint, from a pyrotechnic standpoint, they're crazy. This film is really well made. That being said, I've only ever seen this film once. I watched it once when it came out with you. I've never revisited it. It's one of those films that I think is maybe easier to appreciate than it is a film that you want to just throw on the way that you want to throw on Inception or The Dark Knight or even Interstellar to some degree. So that's why I don't put it in S tier, but for A tier, I just think objectively it's really, really well made.
I completely agree. I put an A tier as well. I think my one negative I remember coming out of seeing this movie was that I felt like there wasn't enough character development. Like we see a lot of them, but we don't get enough of them. I would sort of compare it to on the same level as 1917 and All Quiet on the Western Front in terms of its technical appreciation I have for the movie. I think they're both very well crafted movies, but I think All Quiet on the Western Front and 1917 do a little bit better job of building that character development, where by the end there's a little bit of emotional heft on the characters.
I think that's very true.
Also, just another perspective is just as we're going through these films and just getting more to current times, I think what I love so much about Christopher Nolan is his retention of these practical effects.
Oh yeah, definitely.
All right, so moving on to Christopher Nolan's most recent film that has not released in theaters yet, which is Tenet. Now, Tenet, I think, is a very interesting film because it was made before the pandemic, but then it was put on hold, and then it was one of the first movies actually released in theaters when movie theaters opened back up. So this movie had a lot against it in terms from an audience standpoint and making its money back. I think it's also one of the more debated films in his
Definitely.
history.
It has detractors and it has people that think it's underrated.
I would say torn a little bit between both of those, but a little bit more on the positive side. I did put this in my B tier. Once you put your seatbelt on and you just go for it and you don't think too much about the complexities of how the narrative is constructed, I think this is just such a wild ride of a movie. It takes this concept of the reverse shot, doing everything in a forward motion and then reversing the footage, I think is such a simple idea. But Christopher Nolan has managed to take this simple concept and expand it into a movie that maybe doesn't reach its lofty ambitions, but I thought was just fantastically done. And it looked really amazing, especially by that last sequence.
I agree. I actually put this in A tier. I think Tenet is kind of underrated. I think to some degree I give a filmmaker more credit when they're just willing to completely go for broke and just take whatever it is that's their essence and just go way overboard with it, right? Take a company's money and just go insane. And I think that's what Tenet is. I think Tenet is like the best and worst of Christopher Nolan, all like overflowing incredulity all the time. Another thing I love about it is similar to Inception, it throws you headfirst into this world that you have no idea what's going on. You're just like, okay, I'm in a theater, there's a SWAT team, things are moving backwards, what's happening. I completely understand why some people think the execution of this film it like borders on delirious. I think that that's true, but I have to say on an emotional and honestly on a logical level, it worked for me. With just about any film, if you dig too deeply into it and you ask too many questions, you're going to find flaws. I think this film is maybe easily susceptible to that, but for me, I was right at the level that within the film's logic, I felt like it worked pretty well. And it has some just breathtaking sequences. I mean, the whole last hour where we're seeing things from different perspectives, we're seeing things that happen in different times and different orders. All of that was such a unique and cathartic payoff to where we were before when we were confused in the middle portion of the film. I really liked it. I think maybe we also benefited. We watched this at home. We had heard some mixed reactions. Maybe this is Christopher Nolan's first dud. We watched it together and we maybe reacted against that a bit and said, hey, we really like this. But I have seen it twice and I really liked it both times.
I completely agree. And I think just on maybe a finishing note, I just love how he takes his formula in a certain sense, dealing with new concepts and new themes for movies and building these complex narratives that weave around in structure and playing with time and camera movement, cinematography, and also genre a little bit, going from Batman to mystery and detectives and historical type films. When you're watching a Nolan movie. There's a certain essence about his films, and the way that he takes that through genre and through different types of narratives and movies is just something that isn't replicated by many directors in Hollywood.
He's also one of the few directors that's a box office draw too. Quentin Tarantino, maybe a couple of others. Jordan Peele is actually one. Their films, they're going to be original subject matter in some way, shape, or form, and they're going to have a really decent opening weekend just because of who they are. I mean, not a lot of people like outside of the intense film community have a great knowledge of who directs films. They may have some idea of like the 10 most famous filmmakers, but Christopher Nolan is certainly on that list. I think he's somebody who's consistently pushed his craft, pushed the patience testing of his audience consistently, which I really, really like and I really appreciate about him. For being so successful, he could just rest on his laurels. He could just make BS. And he's never comfortable to do that. He never wants to do that. So I always really appreciate that about him.
All right, and that's it for our tier list on Christopher Nolan's filmography. Let us know in the comments, what do you think about our tier list? What is your tier list? You could send it in the comments below. We'll also update the comments with where we'll put Oppenheimer once we've seen it. We'll also have we'll have a review coming out. So I think we'll just say in that review.
Sure.
Yeah, so we'll put it in the Oppenheimer review where we put this on the tier list. As always, thank you guys for watching and we'll see you next time.